Welcome back to PM Ready, your guide to becoming PMP certified. This is part 1 of the lesson on scope management documents. The scope management documents fall into 2 categories. Those that are part of the project management plan and those that are considered project documents that are important to the project but not included in the project management plan. These are the scope management plan, the requirements management plan, and the scope baseline, which includes the WBS as well as other documents. And project documents about scope include the project scope statement, the requirements documentation, and the requirements traceability matrix. The scope management plan documents how the project and product scope will be defined, validated, and controlled. Notice here that this definition mentions both product and project scope, and these are distinctly different. The product scope is those features and functions that characterize the product, service, or result that the project is launched in order to obtain. The project scope is the work performed to deliver the product, service, or result with those specified features and functions. The project scope, generally speaking, includes both the product scope and the project scope. Project scope includes things such as project management, that is work that you need to do in order to deliver the product. In general, however, the term project scope will refer to both the scope of the product as well as the scope of the work that has to be done to deliver the product. The scope management plan defines the processes that will be used for preparing the project scope statement, the creation of the work breakdown structure, which is derived from the details of the project scope statement, how the scope baseline will be approved and maintained, as well as, of course, how formal acceptance of the completed project deliverables will be obtained. The requirements management plan, on the other hand, describes how the project and product requirements will be analyzed, documented, and managed. It's specifically about the requirements, not about the entire scope of the project. This is also known as the business analysis plan. The requirements management plan will include rules about how to plan, track, and report on your requirements activities, basically your business analysis plan. It'll also include some configuration management rules. Recall that change management is about how changes are requested, reviewed, and approved, whereas configuration management is how changes are made and managed. So here in the context of the requirements management plan, it should specify how changes to the requirements will be initiated, how the impacts will be analyzed, how those changes will be traced, tracked, and reported, as well as the authorization levels that are required to approve any changes to the requirements. The plan should also include how you're going to prioritize the requirements. It may be requirements that are must-haves, nice-to-haves, or any other sort of prioritization process. Whatever you decide to use should be documented here in the requirements management plan. Also, any metrics that you'll use to track and report on requirements should be captured here, as well as some explanation or rationale for why you're using these metrics and how they're beneficial to the process and to the project. It will also include the traceability structure that reflects your requirement attributes that are captured on the traceability matrix. Basically, what the requirements are for your requirements traceability matrix. In order to understand the scope management process, it's important to understand the various documents that are involved, how they interrelate, and what order they're created in. So let's take a look at the order in which these documents are created. First comes the Scope Management Plan, which contains all of the rules for how you're going to manage scope. Also, the Requirements Management Plan, which again contains the rules for how requirements will be managed. Then comes the Requirements Documentation, followed by the Requirements Traceability Matrix. Now, toward the end, you can develop your detailed project scope statement, and finally, the Scope Baseline. This is the order in which these documents are created, and we'll cover each of these in some detail. The requirements documentation is where all of your project requirements are documented. Before this document is baselined, all of your requirements need to be unambiguous, meaning that they are measurable and testable. You need to be able to measure each of these requirements as they're implemented, and you need to be able to test them to ensure that they meet requirements. Each requirement needs to be traceable, which means that you can connect each requirement to the business needs of the project, and that you can trace the requirement throughout the project lifecycle. Each requirement needs to be complete. Make sure you don't leave out important details and err on the side of being more detailed than you think you need to be. All the requirements should be consistent. You definitely don't want requirements that contradict each other. And all of the requirements need to be reviewed and accepted by the key stakeholders. The requirements documentation includes all of the requirements across all of these different areas, from business requirements to stakeholder requirements, requirements for the solution, both functional and non-functional. Functional requirements are usually those kinds of things that are described as features, something that the product or service needs to be able to do. And non-functional requirements are more like quality requirements and things that must be met. For example, a functional requirement might be the need for a particular report. A non-functional requirement might be that that report needs to be generated by the system in 15 seconds or less. Also, any transition and readiness requirements that you'll need in order to transition your result into actual use by operations. Any project requirements. There may be requirements relative to how the project is managed and undertaken that need to be captured here in the requirements documentation. And of course, any quality requirements that need to be documented. Quality requirements could come from your organization or from your industry, and define those requirements for quality that your project should take into consideration. The requirements traceability matrix looks something like this, in which you record every requirement, a short description, you can connect it to business needs, and all sorts of details about the requirement. Each requirement should have a unique ID that you can use to uniquely identify it throughout the project and in other documents. And it serves as a tool for keeping track of all of the requirements throughout the project. The idea behind the requirements traceability matrix is that it links or connects each project requirement from beginning to end. It links it to those business requirements or needs that were identified initially in the project, in the needs assessment. It connects them through the project charter and connects all of the work that's done throughout the project to implement that requirement and develop the features or results and deliverables that the project is meant to deliver. It allows you to track that requirement and make sure that it's being properly managed, that it supports the business and adds real business value, and it provides a structure for you to manage any changes to the project scope. Each requirement should be listed in the requirements traceability matrix, and each requirement should connect to the business need or opportunity or goal or objective. If the requirement doesn't support your business needs and opportunities or your organizational goals and objectives, if you can't tie it to a specific one of these, then it's not a valid requirement. Also, each requirement should connect to one or more of your project objectives. It should support your project objectives. If it doesn't, it's not a good requirement, and probably shouldn't be included in the project. Either that, or the project objectives need to be modified. Each requirement will be connected to the project scope that is defined that needs to be developed, and to each of the work breakdown structure or WBS deliverables. As you go through product design and you're designing how the product should be developed, each of these requirements needs to be included. The same for product development. This traceability matrix helps to make sure that all of the requirements that you've chosen to do for this project actually are done, that they're all completed, and something doesn't get left behind or slip between the cracks. Each requirement will also be connected to a testing strategy or test scenarios that are used to validate that this requirement has been satisfied. And all of your high-level requirements that are broken down into more detailed level requirements should all connect into each other using this traceability matrix. The requirements traceability matrix helps to make sure that every requirement supports the project and the business, and that no requirements selected for the project are forgotten. Here is a list of attributes that should be included for each requirement in the requirements traceability matrix. Each requirement should have a unique identifier. It's very common to have requirements that are similar enough that they can be confusing and that key stakeholders could think you're talking about one when you're talking about another. So it's important for you to have a unique identifier for each requirement. Of course, there should be a short description of the requirement. There should be a reason or rationale for why this requirement is included in this list of requirements. Each requirement should have an owner. Who's responsible for this requirement? You should also record the source, who first came up with the idea of this requirement or who has this requirement as a need. Each requirement should be prioritized. And each requirement could have a version because you will probably end up modifying the requirement details from time to time before your planning is done and later during the course of the project. If you have requirements that are changing like this, you should version them. So you're talking about requirement, whatever number, version 1, version 2, and so on. As this is a living document, each requirement should also have its current status and the date that that status was updated, whether that requirement has been completed or whether it is under development or if it's in design or whatever. Each requirement in the traceability matrix can also include information about stability, required stability and current stability of how well it's been implemented so far. Same for complexity. You can have a measure of how complex you think the requirement is, and you can have a similar measure for how complex it's actually turning out to be. Each requirement should include its acceptance criteria. What's necessary for this requirement to be accepted as complete and done? Now we move on to the project scope statement. What is the project scope statement? From the name, you would think that it's something relatively short, just a statement. But actually, it's not. The project scope statement is the description of the project scope, the major deliverables, assumptions, and constraints. It documents the entire scope of the project, including both project and product scope. And it describes all of these deliverables in detail. you might wonder what the difference is between this and the requirements documentation that you've already put together and put into a requirements traceability matrix. The difference is that the project scope statement does not necessarily include all of the requirements that have been documented so far. You may decide, and it's quite common, that the requirements are more than what you're going to do in this project. So the scope statement narrows this down to what this project is going to do. As a result, it may be wise for you to specifically include some scope exclusions, to specifically mention in the project scope statement those items that you're not going to do as part of this project. This is important for managing stakeholder expectations. It's the project scope statement, not the requirements documentation, that is the baseline for evaluating whether or not you've done everything in the project and whether or not requests or changes for more work fall within the bounds of this project or not. The project scope statement, not the requirements documentation, serves as the baseline. To summarize, the project scope statement includes the product and project scope described in detail, elaborating on all of the characteristics of the product, service, or result that was described in the project charter and the requirements documentation. It includes a list of the deliverables and describes those deliverables either at a summary level or in great detail. It includes the acceptance criteria or set of conditions that are required for these deliverables to be accepted. It also includes a list of project exclusions, items of scope that will not be done as part of this project to help manage stakeholder expectations. Now, of course, a lot of this material is already found in the requirements documentation, so it doesn't have to be duplicated here. It can be referenced from here. So the project scope statement may have many references to the project requirements documentation and the requirements traceability matrix. And now at last we come to the work breakdown structure, abbreviated WBS. There's a lot of confusion and misunderstanding about what a work breakdown structure is, how it's used, and how it should be organized. We'll go through this one step at a time. Here's an example of a very simple work breakdown structure. It's not nearly complete enough for a real project, but just for illustrative purposes, we'll go with this one. The work breakdown structure is a hierarchy. In this case, it's represented as a tree diagram. At the top of this tree, you have the project itself. Below that, you have a layer or level of deliverables. This list of deliverables comes from the project charter, from the project scope statement, and then they're put into this hierarchy. From there, they're further defined, further divided. The term that PMI uses is decomposition, the process of decomposing the project into its various deliverables and components and subcomponents and so on. Below the deliverable layer, you can have all the different components that make up those deliverables. This concludes part 1 of the lesson on scope management documents. PM Ready is a publication of PM Guaranteed and is based on the Project Management Institute's PMBOK guide.